For the first time ever, India has openly challenged China over its illegal occupation of Tibet. Even as Indian Army and Indian Air Force remain locked in a military standoff against the Chinese PLA along the LAC border in Ladakh, Indian Foreign Ministry has now dared China over its 60 years of illegal occupation of Tibet. The latest spark in this bitter standoff were satellite images of a bridge over the Pangong Tso Pangong Lake in Ladakh that China has now completed and is using to ferry tanks and troops to the southern bank of the lake near India. Indian Foreign Ministry stated, quote, "This bridge is being constructed in areas that have been under illegal occupation by China for around 60 years now. As you are well aware, India has never accepted such illegal occupation." Illegal occupation. The term was used twice by India in an official statement. Now, this statement directly refers to China's military takeover of Tibet back in the 1950s. In other words, India believes that while Beijing may have captured Tibet and may be governing the region, it remains an independent nation which historically was never part of China in thousands of years of its history. But why now? Why have satellite images of the Pangong Bridge sparked such fury from the Indian government? Recently, India and China held 30th round of border talks to ease tensions, but China continues to refuse to pull back its troops from previously neutral territories it occupied when Indian military was battling the COVID pandemic like the rest of the nation. On one hand, CCP leadership claims it is speeding up efforts to de-escalate. On the other hand, it is constructing border infrastructure that directly threatens India's territorial sovereignty. The latest bridge is a shining example that New Delhi perhaps cannot trust Beijing to find lasting peace at the border. Pangong Lake is situated at a height of nearly 4,350 meters and it's the world's highest saltwater lake. It's a huge water body extending nearly 130 kilometers. One-third of this lake lies in India and two-thirds of it lies in Tibet. Now, this 400-meter bridge lies 25 kilometers away from the LAC, well inside land currently occupied by China. The PLA troops have blacktopped it and have begun using it to transport troops. This is a highly strategic bridge and gives China a tactical edge by cutting down travel time between north and south banks of this huge 130-kilometer long lake. At the same time, it now becomes target number one for any Indian missile strikes in case of a conflict. Rest assured, China has been fortifying positions around the bridge with missile defense systems and artillery systems. Recently, satellite images also showed Chinese PLA has constructed underground bunkers for its tanks and armored vehicles and command centers on the northern bank of this Pangong Lake. Now, this Pangong Tso is also the venue of a bitter hand-to-hand combat between Indian Army troops and Chinese PLA in 2020, the same year when similar clashes in Galwan Valley led to deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and up to 35 PLA casualties. So, is China's occupation of Tibet legal or illegal? Now, in 1954 Panchsheel Agreement, India acknowledged that Tibet is under Chinese administration. However, the current Modi government has clarified that India never accepted this illegal occupation of Tibet by China. In other words, back in 1954, New Delhi acknowledged the ground reality of Tibet, but it was not an admission that Tibet is part of China. Tibetan spiritual leader Dalai Lama, along with tens of thousands of Tibetan refugees, continue to live in India after having escaped Chinese military onslaught in 1950s. In fact, Dalai Lama even met a US Senate delegation in India as the US Congress passed the Resolve Tibet Bill, which is aimed to help and support the Tibetan people and their cause. As expected, China reacted harshly to US delegation and Nancy Pelosi meeting the Dalai Lama, with the Chinese Foreign Ministry stating the US should, quote, fully recognize the anti-China and separatist nature of the Dalai clique and refrain from, quote, any form of contact with it, unquote. Now, for decades, world's leading powers have been guilty of ignoring the plight of Tibetans for the price of cheap Chinese goods. However, recently, the United States, along with India, have extended more support. Tibet is a vast country, greater in size to United Kingdom, Italy and Poland put together. It is culturally rich and has vast natural resources. Tibet holds the world's third largest natural freshwater reserve after the South Pole and the Arctic region. Now, this paper in the US Department of Defense website highlights how China has been weaponizing the water resources in Tibet to harm the lower riparian states. According to reports, this has been especially seen in the ASEAN region and the Mekong River. Tibetan freshwater supply is essential for the population and industrial hubs in eastern and northern China. Tibet as a country had a history of more than 2000 years and had its own flag, language, stamps, currency and even army. It shared a long border and close cultural ties with India. Now, one of Hinduism's most sacred sites, the Kailash Mansarovar, lies inside Tibet, while there are tens of ancient Tibetan monasteries located in India. For over 2000 years, Tibet was a free country with ties to both India and China. According to freetibet.org, China's entire claim to Tibet is based on influence of Mongol and Manchu rulers on Tibet in 13th and 18th centuries. Back then, even China had been subjugated to Mongol control. Now, it adds that Tibet broke away even before the Chinese secured their independence from the Mongols. In fact, Mongols ruled parts of China for nearly a century between 1200 AD to 1300 AD. So, do those regions today become Mongolia? If not, then similarly, Tibet should remain Tibet, despite current Chinese military control. Freetibet.org also states that the Ming dynasty, which followed from 1368 to 1644, had diplomatic ties to Tibet, but no actual control over the country. But the Chinese CCP used these ties as an excuse to launch an invasion and capture Tibet by a military invasion in 1950s. Now, despite the fact that decades ago in 1912, the 12th Dalai Lama issued a proclamation acknowledging Tibet as a free and independent country. Tibetans have continued to protest against Chinese control, and more than 150 Tibetans have even self-immolated inside Tibet since 2009. In fact, a report by the United Nations highlighted how CCP is destroying Tibetan culture. Chinese authorities have allegedly separated nearly 1 million Tibetan children from their families in order to reduce influence of Tibetan heritage. While India has been a safe haven for Tibetan refugees for decades, the Indian government had never openly questioned Chinese rule over Tibet till recently. However, now New Delhi has taken a more proactive approach to this issue. Recently, Prime Minister Modi's government also restored 30 ancient names of places in Tibet that existed before the Chinese occupation in 1950s. Now, this was in response to China claiming India's Arunachal Pradesh state as southern Tibet. Even the US Congress acknowledges Arunachal as part of India, but Beijing continues to provoke nonetheless. But the question remains, why now? Why is India challenging China now on Tibet? It all comes down to Chinese border aggression and salami slicing and attempts to change the status quo in 2020, when Indian military is battling the COVID pandemic that emerged from China and crippled the entire world. Chinese salami slicing created a trust deficit in India that perhaps the CCP cannot be trusted and will always threaten India's territorial sovereignty. India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar admitted this as recently as last week during the Quad meeting in Tokyo. He said, quote, "Right now, I have to be honest, our relations with China are not doing well. The main reason for that was in 2020, during COVID, China brought very large forces to the border areas between India and China in violation of agreements we had with China," unquote. For years, China has been violating India's sovereignty with projects like the CPEC inside Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Now, POK is legally Indian territory, as the king of princely state of Kashmir willingly acceded to India after independence from the British. China has also been militarizing Tibet at a rapid pace to crush any rebellions or threat to the border regions from India. Chinese PLA even recently stationed its most advanced J-20 stealth fighter jets inside Tibet, barely 150 kilometers from the border with India's Sikkim. While the Communist Party of China, through its statements, continues to advocate for peace, its actions on the ground continue to threaten India's national security. So can India ever trust China? And do you support Indian government's official statement that India has never accepted 60 years of illegal occupation of Tibet by China? Leave a comment, hit the like button and subscribe to InConnect News.